My name is Rita, and for 55 years I believed in something that turned out to be a beautiful lie. I believed that love, sacrifice, and devotion would always be returned in kind. I believed that raising a child with everything you have would create an unbreakable bond. I believed that being a good mother meant I would never truly be alone. But sometimes, the people we love the most are the ones who teach us the cruelest lessons about human nature. I used to own a small flower shop on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, just a cozy little place where neighbors came to buy roses for anniversaries and chrysanthemums for their gardens. Those flowers were my pride, my independence, my proof that I could build something beautiful with my own hands. The scent of fresh peonies in spring, the way sunlight streamed through the shop windows in the afternoon, the satisfied smile on a customer's face when they found exactly what they needed. That shop was more than a business. It was my identity, my sanctuary, my future. But when my husband Robert got sick, really sick, everything changed. Cancer has a way of reshaping your entire world without asking permission. One day you're planning vacation trips and discussing retirement dreams, and the next you're learning medical terminology you never wanted to understand, counting pills, and watching the man you married disappear inch by inch inside a body that's betraying him. The doctors said he needed full-time care. The insurance covered some things, but not the kind of round-the-clock attention that would give him dignity in his final months. I had a choice to make: hire strangers to care for the man I'd loved for 30 years, or close my shop and become his caregiver myself. There was no choice, really. When you love someone that deeply, their comfort becomes more important than your own dreams. So I sold my flower shop to a young couple who promised to keep its character intact, and I used that money to give Robert the best possible care. I learned to operate feeding tubes, manage medication schedules, and provide the kind of patient, gentle care that only comes from love that has deepened over decades. For 2 years, I poured everything I had into keeping Robert comfortable, keeping him connected to life, keeping hope alive in our home even when the medical prognosis offered none. I slept in chairs beside his bed. I sang to him when he couldn't sleep. I held his hand through treatments that left him weak and nauseated. I became his nurse, his companion, his advocate with doctors who sometimes forgot that behind every case number was a human being with a history and a heart. When Robert died, I felt like part of my soul had been amputated. But even in my grief, I wasn't afraid of being alone. My son Daniel had been so supportive during his father's illness, visiting regularly, helping with medical appointments, promising that our family would stay strong no matter what happened. "Mom," he'd said, holding my hands at Robert's funeral while tears streamed down both our faces, "you'll never be alone. You gave up everything to take care of Dad, and now it's my turn to take care of you. Come live with us." Sarah and the kids would love having their grandmother around more often. Those words felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in grief. At 55, starting over seemed impossible. The flower shop was gone, my savings depleted by medical expenses, my daily routine completely disrupted by loss. Daniel's invitation wasn't just generous, it felt like a natural continuation of the family bonds we'd always cherished. Sarah, his wife, seemed genuinely happy about the arrangement. "We have that big guest room that never gets used," she said, squeezing my shoulder with what felt like sincere affection. "And honestly, Rita, we could use the help with the kids. You know how crazy our schedules get." So I moved in with Daniel's family, bringing only what could fit in their spare bedroom. Most of my furniture went to charity, along with decades of accumulated possessions that had defined my independent life. I told myself this was just a temporary adjustment, a chance to heal from Robert's death while being surrounded by family who loved me. At first, everything seemed perfect. I helped with dinner preparations, spent time with my grandchildren after school, contributed what I could to household expenses from Robert's modest life insurance payout. I felt useful again, needed, part of something larger than my own grief. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. I love connecting with people from all over the world. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. Daniel's warm welcomes became brief nods. Sarah's invitations to join family activities became less frequent. The grandchildren, who'd initially been excited about having Grandma in the house, seemed to have less time for the stories and games we used to share. I told myself it was natural. Families need time to adjust to new living arrangements. Everyone was busy with work and school, and the countless obligations that fill modern life. I was probably being too sensitive, too eager for attention during a vulnerable time when grief was making me needier than usual, but deep inside, a small voice kept whispering that something fundamental was shifting. The way conversations stopped when I entered rooms. The way my suggestions about family plans were politely ignored or quickly dismissed. The way I'd begun to feel like a guest who'd stayed too long rather than a family member who belonged. I started spending more time in my room, reading books I'd checked out from the library and trying not to notice how quiet the house became when I wasn't actively participating in family life. I told myself this was normal, that every family had rhythms and routines that took time to accommodate new members. Still, loneliness crept in like winter fog, slow, persistent, chilling everything it touched. I missed my flower shop more than I'd expected, missed having my own space, my own purpose, my own sense of contributing something meaningful to the world. I missed being Rita the florist, Rita the wife, Rita the woman with her own life to manage. Now I was just Rita the mother, Rita the grandmother, Rita the woman who needed care rather than someone capable of caring for others. And that's when I began to understand that sometimes the cruelest prisons are built by people who claim to love us. The first sign that my welcome was wearing thin came 3 months after I'd moved in. Sarah had been planning Tommy's 8th birthday party, and I'd offered to make my famous chocolate cake. The same recipe I'd used for Daniel's birthdays when he was growing up. The same cake he used to beg me to make for special occasions. "Oh, that's sweet of you to offer, Rita," Sarah said, barely looking up from her laptop where she was ordering decorations online. "But I've already ordered a superhero cake from the bakery. The kids these days, you know? They want everything to look perfect for photos. Perfect for photos. As if my homemade cake, made with love and decades of experience, somehow wasn't good enough for social media. As if the same hands that had baked countless birthday cakes for her own husband were suddenly inadequate for her children. I watched her scroll through party supply websites, selecting decorations that cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week. Every click seemed to emphasize how out of touch I was with modern parenting, how my old-fashioned ways didn't fit into their carefully curated family image. Maybe I could help with the decorating, I suggested, remembering how Daniel and I used to spend hours setting up parties with handmade banners and creative games that didn't require expensive equipment. "Actually, we hired a party planner," Sarah replied, still not making eye contact. "Everything's taken care of. But thanks anyway. Everything's taken care of." The phrase hit me like a gentle slap, polite but unmistakably dismissive. I was being managed, handled, kept at arm's length from my own grandson's celebration. The party planner was welcome in their home to create memories, but the grandmother who'd raised the birthday boy's father was just an afterthought offering help that wasn't needed. The party itself was a masterpiece of modern childhood entertainment. Bounce house, face painting, a magician who kept the kids mesmerized for an hour. I sat in a corner chair, watching my grandson blow out candles on a store-bought cake while professional photographers captured every moment for Sarah's Instagram account. Nobody asked me to share stories about Daniel's childhood birthdays. Nobody invited me into the group photos with family friends I'd never met. When Tommy opened his presents, he barely glanced at the wooden puzzle I'd carefully selected. Something educational and beautiful that would last longer than the plastic toys that filled the rest of his pile. "Say thank you to Grandma Rita," Sarah prompted mechanically, the way you'd remind a child to thank a distant relative for an obligatory gift. Tommy mumbled his thanks without looking away from the remote control car that had captured his attention, and I realized I was becoming invisible in my own family. Not ignored exactly, but treated with the kind of polite distance reserved for elderly relatives you see once a year at Christmas. That evening, after the last guest had left and the expensive decorations were being packed away, I offered to help clean up. "We've got it covered, Mom," Daniel said, already loading the dishwasher with an efficiency that suggested this was routine. "Why don't you go rest?" Rest. As if I were an invalid who needed to conserve energy rather than a capable woman who'd been managing households longer than he'd been alive. As if helping clean up after my grandson's party would somehow be too taxing for my delicate constitution. I retreated to my room and listened to the sounds of family life continuing without me. Sarah and Daniel discussing the party's success, the children being bathed and put to bed, the comfortable evening routine of a family that functioned perfectly well without my participation. The exclusion became more systematic after that. Family dinners shifted to earlier times when I was usually resting, or later times when I'd already eaten something simple in my room. "We didn't want to wake you," became the standard explanation for decisions made without consulting me. Weekend plans were discussed in hushed tones and finalized before I knew they were being considered. Beach trips, visits to friends, museum outings, all organized around schedules that somehow never included checking whether I might want to join them. "It's a lot of walking," Sarah would explain when I discovered they'd gone to the zoo without mentioning it. "We thought it might be too much for you. Too much for me." At 55, I was apparently too fragile for family outings that included children half my age, too delicate for normal activities that I'd been enjoying independently for decades. My age had become a convenient excuse for exclusion, a way to justify leaving me behind without acknowledging that they simply preferred my absence. The children's attitudes shifted too, reflecting their parents' subtle signals that Grandma Rita was more obligation than joy. Emma, who used to beg for bedtime stories, began saying she was too tired when I offered to read to her. Tommy stopped showing me his school projects and homework, running straight to his parents when he came home each day. When I tried to help with homework one afternoon, explaining math problems the way I'd successfully taught Daniel years earlier, Tommy looked confused and frustrated. "Mom does it differently," he said, pushing my pencil away. "I need to do it her way for school." Sarah appeared in the doorway at exactly that moment, as if she'd been listening for signs that I might overstep boundaries. "Thanks for trying to help, Rita, but I should probably take over. They're using new methods now that are different from what we learned." New methods. As if mathematics had fundamentally changed since I was in school. As if my decades of successfully helping children with homework had become obsolete overnight. As if my experience and knowledge were outdated relics that might confuse children who needed modern approaches to learning. I began to notice how conversations stopped when I entered rooms, then resumed in carefully neutral tones about weather and grocery shopping, rather than the more personal topics they'd been discussing before my arrival. Important family decisions were made without my input, then announced to me as fait accompli. When Sarah's mother came to visit for a week, the contrast was striking. Margaret was included in every activity, consulted about every decision, welcomed into conversations about the children's futures and the family's plans. She helped with cooking, joined shopping trips, participated in bedtime routines with the easy intimacy of someone whose presence was genuinely valued. "Rita, you remember my mother Margaret," Sarah said when introducing us, as if we hadn't met several times before. "She's staying with us for the week." Margaret looked at me with the polite sympathy reserved for poor relations, offering pleasantries about how nice it must be to live with family, while clearly understanding that my situation was different from hers. She was a welcomed guest. I was a permanent resident whose welcome had expired. During Margaret's visit, I ate more meals alone than I had in the previous month combined. Family activities multiplied, but my invitations disappeared entirely. 3 generations might be too crowded for the restaurant, became the explanation for dinners I wasn't included in. I watched from my bedroom window as they loaded into the car for outings I hadn't known were planned. Sarah's mother settling into the front passenger seat that had become my symbolic place of exile. That seat next to Daniel used to be mine during family trips, back when I was considered essential rather than optional. The message was becoming unmistakably clear. There was room for one grandmother in this family's activities, and it wasn't going to be me. By December, I'd convinced myself that the holidays would change everything. Surely Christmas would remind us all of what family meant, would bring back the warmth and connection that seemed to have gotten lost in the daily routines of busy lives. I threw myself into holiday preparations with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove their worth through sheer effort and good intentions. I spent my small monthly income on thoughtful gifts, carefully chosen items that showed how well I knew each family member. For Tommy, a beginner's woodworking set, because he'd mentioned wanting to build a birdhouse. For Emma, a beautiful journal with her name embossed on the cover because she'd started writing little stories. For Sarah, an elegant scarf in her favorite color that I'd remembered from an offhand comment months earlier. For Daniel, a framed photo of him and his father from his college graduation, a moment I thought he'd want to preserve. I spent weeks wrapping each present perfectly, adding handwritten notes that recalled special memories and expressed my love for each of them. These weren't expensive gifts, but they were chosen with the kind of attention that only comes from truly caring about someone's happiness. On Christmas morning, I woke early and made coffee, then sat in the living room waiting for the family to gather around the tree. The presents I'd carefully arranged under the branches looked modest compared to the elaborate packages Sarah and Daniel had bought for each other and the children. But I told myself that love mattered more than price tags. When the family finally assembled, the children tore through their pile of expensive electronics and designer clothes with the efficient enthusiasm of kids who'd learned to expect abundance. My carefully chosen gifts were opened quickly, acknowledged with brief thank yous, then set aside without the kind of examination that suggested genuine interest. Tommy glanced at the woodworking set for about 3 seconds before reaching for his new gaming console. Emma flipped through the journal's blank pages once, then returned to organizing her collection of art supplies that clearly cost more than I'd spent on everyone combined. "That's very thoughtful, Mom," Daniel said, holding up the framed photo with the polite appreciation you'd show a stranger's gift. But I noticed he set it down immediately, and didn't mention the memory it represented or the significance of that graduation day when Robert and I had been so proud of our son's achievements. Sarah examined the scarf with the critical eye of someone evaluating quality rather than sentiment. "This is nice," she said, though her tone suggested it wasn't quite her style. "I'll have to find occasions to wear it." Occasions to wear it. As if a gift from her mother-in-law required special circumstances rather than being something she might actually enjoy using. As if my understanding of her preferences was so poor that the scarf would need to be worked into her wardrobe rather than welcomed into it. But the real blow came when I realized that while I'd spent weeks selecting personal gifts for each of them, they'd clearly forgotten about me entirely until the last minute. Daniel handed me an envelope containing a gift card to a local restaurant. Not even a restaurant I'd mentioned liking, just a generic chain that suggested no thought about my actual preferences. "We thought you might enjoy a nice dinner out," Sarah added, though her attention was already shifting back to helping Emma set up her new tablet. It's so hard to know what to get people. Hard to know what to get people. After living in their house for 8 months, after countless conversations about my interests and memories, after decades of being Daniel's mother, they couldn't think of a single thing I might actually want or need. The gift card felt like a payment to a service provider rather than a present for a beloved family member. But I smiled and thanked them, because what else could I do? Complaining about gifts would make me seem ungrateful, demanding, like the kind of difficult relative that families tolerate rather than treasure. I told myself that gift-giving had never been their strength, that love was expressed in other ways that I was probably too sensitive to notice. That afternoon, while the children played with their new toys and Daniel and Sarah relaxed with their expensive wine and gourmet cheese selections, I offered to prepare Christmas dinner. I'd been planning a traditional meal with all the dishes that had made our family celebrations special when Daniel was growing up. The herb-crusted turkey that Robert had always carved with ceremony, the stuffing recipe that had been passed down from my grandmother, the cranberry sauce I made from scratch because the canned version never tasted quite right. "Actually, Mom, we already made reservations at the Riverside Inn," Daniel said without looking up from his new book. "They have a special Christmas buffet that's supposed to be fantastic. Reservations. Made without consulting me, planned around my absence, scheduled as if I weren't part of the family that would be celebrating together. The restaurant was expensive, the kind of place that required advance planning and special occasion budgets. They'd clearly been looking forward to this meal for weeks while I'd been foolishly planning to cook for them. "Oh," I said, trying to hide my disappointment. That sounds lovely. What time should I be ready? The silence that followed was loud enough to fill the entire room. Daniel and Sarah exchanged a look that I'd become familiar with. The visual communication of two people who needed to coordinate their response to an awkward situation. The thing is, Mom, Sarah said slowly, we only made reservations for 4. The kids really wanted to try this place, and we thought you might prefer staying home and resting. You know how crowded restaurants get on holidays. As if I were an invalid who couldn't handle normal social situations. As if being around other families celebrating Christmas would somehow be too stimulating for my delicate constitution. As if I were the kind of elderly person who needed to be protected from the excitement of holiday dining rather than included in it. I could call and see if they can add 1 more to the reservation, I offered, though my voice sounded small even to myself. It's probably too late, Daniel said quickly. These places book up months in advance for Christmas. And honestly, Mom, the portions are really large there. Might be too much food. Too much food. Another gentle insult disguised as concern for my welfare. At 55, I was apparently too fragile for restaurant portions, too delicate for family celebrations, too much trouble to include in holiday plans that had been made specifically to exclude me. I spent Christmas afternoon alone in the house, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood families returning from their own celebrations while I made myself a sandwich from the leftover grocery store turkey I found in the refrigerator. The silence felt different than the peaceful quiet I'd once enjoyed. This was the hollow echo of abandonment, the specific loneliness that comes from being forgotten by people who were supposed to remember you mattered. When they returned from dinner, full of stories about the delicious food and festive atmosphere, I listened with the polite interest of someone hearing about experiences I'd never be invited to share. The children were sleepy and satisfied. Daniel and Sarah relaxed and happy from their special meal. Everyone had had exactly the Christmas they'd wanted, except for the person who'd spent months hoping to be included in creating those memories. You should have seen the dessert buffet, Mom, Daniel said, loosening his belt with the satisfied gesture of someone who'd eaten well. Maybe we can take you there another time. Another time. The conditional promise that every excluded person learns to recognize. The vague future invitation that makes the present rejection seem temporary and considerate rather than permanent and cruel. Another time that would never come. Another occasion that would somehow never be quite right for including the inconvenient family member who complicated their perfect group dynamics. That night, lying in bed in a house that had never felt less like home, I finally admitted to myself what I'd been trying to deny for months. I wasn't a beloved family member who was temporarily misunderstood. I wasn't a grieving widow who needed time to adjust to new living arrangements. I wasn't even an honored elder whose presence added wisdom and continuity to family life. I was a burden, an obligation, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. And the worst part was that they were all so polite about it, so careful to frame their exclusion as concern for my welfare, that I couldn't even be angry without seeming ungrateful for their supposed kindness. But deep inside, something was beginning to shift. The hurt was still there, sharp and constant, but underneath it, a different feeling was taking root. Not anger exactly, and not resignation either. Something quieter but stronger. The solid certainty that comes when you finally understand exactly where you stand. January brought a cold that seemed to seep into my bones and stay there, no matter how many layers I wore or how high I turned up the heat in my small room. But the chill I felt had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the gradual realization that I'd become a ghost in my own son's house. Present but unseen, speaking but unheard, existing but not really living. The post-holiday routine settled over the household like a heavy blanket, and with it came a new level of casual dismissal that felt more cutting than the polite exclusion I'd grown accustomed to. It was as if whatever thin pretense of family warmth had been maintained through the holiday season had finally been abandoned now that the performative aspects of togetherness were no longer required. Sarah stopped asking if I wanted coffee when she made her morning pot. Daniel stopped saying good morning when he passed my room on his way to work. The children resumed their school routines without acknowledging my presence in the kitchen when they grabbed their breakfast and backpacks. I'd become part of the furniture, noticed only when I was somehow in the way. One morning in late January, I found myself standing in the kitchen at 6:30, making tea and trying to catch a moment of connection with Daniel before he left for work. He was rushing around gathering his laptop and papers, moving with the efficient haste of someone whose mind was already at the office. "Have a good day, honey," I said, using the same gentle tone I'd used to send him off to school for 12 years of his childhood. He paused for just a moment, and I thought he might actually respond with something more than his usual grunt of acknowledgement. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not affection, but something that made my stomach tighten with worry. "Mom," he said slowly, "we need to talk soon. About arrangements." Arrangements. The word hung in the air after he left, loaded with implications that I wasn't ready to examine too closely. What kind of arrangements? Arrangements for what? The vague threat of that single word followed me through the rest of the day like a shadow I couldn't shake. That afternoon, while Sarah was at work and the children were at school, I tried to make myself useful by organizing the cluttered family room, not rearranging anything major, just straightening magazines and folding throw blankets, the kind of light housework that might demonstrate my value as a household member. When Sarah came home and saw what I'd done, her reaction wasn't gratitude. It was barely contained irritation. "Rita," she said, surveying the tidied room with obvious displeasure. "I had those magazines arranged the way I wanted them, and those blankets were positioned specifically for the staging photos I've been taking for Instagram." Staging photos. I'd unknowingly disrupted her carefully curated domestic aesthetic, the artificial arrangements that made their home look perfect for social media. My attempt to help had interfered with her image management, and I could see in her face that this was somehow the last straw rather than a minor inconvenience. "I'm sorry," I said, already moving to put things back the way I'd found them. "I was just trying to—" "I know what you were trying to do," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "But this is our space, Rita, our home. Maybe it would be better if you just stayed in your room more. Our space. Our home." The message was unmistakable. I didn't belong in the common areas of the house where I'd been invited to live. My presence was disruptive to their family life. My attempts to contribute were unwelcome interference. I was a tenant whose lease had expired, a guest who'd overstayed her welcome by about 6 months. That evening, I heard Daniel and Sarah talking in their bedroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls in fragments that I couldn't help but overhear. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when you're living in limbo, your ears become attuned to conversations that might contain information about your fate. "Can't go on like this." Sarah's voice, frustrated and tired. "I know, but it's complicated." Daniel's response, equally strained. "Your mother, but she's—" More words I couldn't catch. Then Sarah again. "Affecting the kids. Uncomfortable in their own home. Affecting the kids. Uncomfortable in their own home." I was being blamed for creating tension in a family that had systematically excluded me from every meaningful interaction. My presence was somehow poisoning the domestic harmony. My mere existence in their space was causing problems that required solutions I wouldn't be consulted about. I pulled my blanket over my head and tried to block out their voices, but the damage was done. Whatever small hope I'd been clinging to, that things might improve, that we might find our way back to being a real family, crumbled into dust that night. I wasn't a beloved mother and grandmother going through a difficult adjustment period. I was a problem that needed to be solved, a burden that needed to be lifted, an obstacle to their happiness that they were finally ready to remove. The next few weeks passed in a haze of careful politeness and growing distance. I stopped offering to help with anything, stopped trying to join conversations, stopped pretending that I had any real place in their daily lives. I became what they apparently wanted me to be: invisible, silent, taking up as little space as possible while they figured out how to get rid of me permanently. I started spending entire days in my room, coming out only to use the bathroom and occasionally grab something simple to eat when the kitchen was empty. I told myself I was giving them the space they clearly wanted, But really I was hiding from the constant reminder that I'd become unwelcome in the only place I had to live. During those long, solitary hours, I found myself thinking about Robert constantly. Not the sick, dying Robert of his final years, but the young man who'd promised to love me forever, who'd believed in our future together, who'd never imagined that his wife would end up alone and unwanted in their son's house. I wondered what he would think of Daniel's coldness, of Sarah's barely concealed resentment, of the way his grandchildren had been taught to see their grandmother as an inconvenience rather than a blessing. Sometimes I imagined conversations with Robert, explaining to him how everything had gone wrong, asking him for advice about what to do when the family you'd sacrificed everything for decided you were expendable. But even in my imagination, he had no answers. Death had taken him beyond the reach of human cruelty, but it had left me behind to face it alone. One particularly dark Tuesday in February, after a morning of pretending not to notice how the family had eaten breakfast and left for work without acknowledging my existence, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, holding the bottle of sleeping pills that had been prescribed after Robert's death, not because I wanted to hurt myself, but because I was trying to remember what it felt like to have a future worth planning for. The pills rattled gently in their plastic container, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I truly understood why some people simply gave up. When you've outlived your usefulness to the people you love most, when your presence causes more problems than joy, when every day brings fresh evidence that you're a burden rather than a blessing, it becomes hard to see the point of continuing. I sat there for a long time, not making any decisions, just acknowledging how thoroughly my life had been dismantled. The flower shop was gone. Robert was gone. My independence was gone. My savings were gone. My purpose was gone. My welcome was gone. Even my son's love seemed to have evaporated, replaced by obligation and resentment that grew stronger every day. But somewhere in that dark moment, when I'd reached the absolute bottom of despair, something stirred. Not hope exactly, and not anger either. Something quieter but more powerful. A tiny spark of the woman I used to be before I became someone else's burden. I put the pill bottle back in the drawer without opening it, not because I'd found reasons to be optimistic, but because I suddenly remembered something important. I still had something they'd forgotten about, something they didn't know existed, something that might change everything. What they didn't know, what Daniel had either forgotten or chosen to ignore, was that when Robert and I bought our first house 32 years ago, his father had insisted on a particular arrangement. Robert's dad was a practical man who'd lived through the Depression, and he'd learned not to trust that good times would last forever. Put both names on everything, he'd told us over Sunday dinner at his kitchen table, pointing his fork at us for emphasis. Bank accounts, property deeds, insurance policies, everything. You never know when one of you might need to make decisions for both. So when Robert and I purchased the little Victorian house on Elm Street, our first real home together, the place where we'd planned to grow old, both our names went on the deed. Equal ownership, equal rights, equal say in what happened to our shared investment. When Robert got sick and we needed money for treatments that insurance wouldn't cover, we'd discussed selling the house. The real estate market was strong, and the property had tripled in value over the 3 decades we'd lived there. But Robert had refused. Even when the medical bills mounted and our savings dwindled. "That house is your security, Rita," he'd said during one of his clearer moments in the final weeks. "Promise me you won't sell it unless you absolutely have to. Promise me you'll always have somewhere that belongs to you." I'd promised, though at the time I thought his concern was unnecessary. Daniel was family, and family took care of each other. I'd never need to claim my half of a house when I had a loving son who wanted me to live with him. But sitting in that cold bedroom, feeling like an unwelcome stranger in what was supposed to be my refuge, I remembered that promise. More importantly, I remembered that I still owned half of a house that was now worth nearly $400,000. A house that sat empty while I lived like a charity case in my son's spare room. The next morning, while Daniel was at work and Sarah was running errands, I walked to the public library 3 blocks away. The same library where I'd spent countless Saturday mornings with young Daniel, helping him with school reports and feeding his curiosity about everything from dinosaurs to astronomy. Now I was there on a different kind of research mission. I spent 2 hours at the computer, looking up property records and researching my legal rights as a co-owner. What I discovered made my hands shake as I took notes on the small pad I'd brought with me. Not only did I still own half the house, but as the surviving spouse, I had the legal right to live there regardless of what anyone else wanted. The house had been sitting empty for 8 months while Daniel figured out what to do with it. He'd mentioned occasionally that he needed to clean it out and put it on the market. But those conversations always happened around me rather than with me, as if the property were entirely his to dispose of. But it wasn't entirely his. Half of everything Robert and I had built together belonged to me, and I'd never signed anything giving up those rights. In my grief and gratitude for Daniel's offer of shelter, I'd simply walked away from my own home without considering that I didn't have to. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt like waking up from a long, confused sleep. I was going to visit the house on Elm Street, my house, and see exactly what I'd been missing. The 20-minute bus ride felt like traveling back in time. As we passed familiar neighborhoods and landmarks, I remembered the woman I'd been before grief and dependency had stripped away my confidence. I'd once been Rita Morrison, small business owner, homeowner, wife, and mother. Not just Rita, the unwanted houseguest who needed to be managed and eventually relocated. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but solid and welcoming in ways that Daniel's modern suburban home had never felt. The front porch where Robert and I used to drink morning coffee still held the swing we'd installed for our 10th anniversary. The garden I'd tended for decades showed signs of winter dormancy, but the perennial plants I'd carefully chosen and nurtured were still there, waiting for spring to call them back to life. I used my key, Daniel hadn't thought to ask for it back, and stepped into the front hallway that had witnessed 30 years of our family's daily life. The house smelled like dust and emptiness, but underneath those surface scents, I could still detect traces of the home we'd created together. Lemon oil from the furniture polish I'd used religiously, lavender from the sachets I'd tucked into closets, the indefinable scent of a place where people had been genuinely happy. Most of our furniture was still there, covered with sheets like ghosts of the life we'd shared. Daniel had taken a few pieces: Robert's desk, the dining room set that had belonged to his grandmother, some of the electronics. But the bones of our home remained intact, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. I walked through each room slowly, remembering not just the big moments we'd celebrated here, but the ordinary Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings that had made up the fabric of our marriage. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, the living room where we'd watched our son grow from boy to man, the bedroom where Robert had died peacefully in his sleep 6 months after his final treatment failed. But as I moved through the familiar rooms, I wasn't dwelling on the past. I was planning for the future. A future that didn't depend on Daniel's charity or Sarah's tolerance. A future where I lived in my own space, made my own decisions, and rebuilt the independence I'd surrendered when grief made me vulnerable. The house needed work. 8 months of neglect had created problems that required attention. Some windows needed resealing, the furnace needed servicing, the yard needed cleaning up. But these were manageable tasks, the kind of maintenance challenges that came with homeownership, rather than insurmountable obstacles. More importantly, the house needed a resident who would love it back to life. Someone who understood its quirks and appreciated its character. Someone who had history within its walls and vision for its future. That evening, I returned to Daniel's house feeling different than I had in months. Not angry or confrontational, but quietly determined. I ate dinner in my room as usual, listened to the family's evening routine as usual, went to bed at my usual time, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life being managed like a problem that needed solving. I wasn't going to accept being treated like a burden by people who'd forgotten that I'd spent 30 years creating the financial foundation that allowed them to live comfortably. I wasn't going to pretend that being unwelcome in my son's house was the same thing as being homeless. Over the next several days, I began making quiet preparations. I researched utility companies and arranged to have services restored to the Elm Street house. I contacted the insurance company to reactivate the homeowner's policy that had been suspended but not canceled. I made appointments with a handyman to address the most urgent maintenance issues. All of this I did during the day while Daniel worked and Sarah managed her own busy schedule. I used the public library's computer and phone, paid for services with the modest checking account I'd maintained separately from the household finances Daniel managed. I moved carefully and quietly, not because I was being secretive, but because I'd learned the value of completing plans before announcing them to people who might try to interfere. Most importantly, I began to remember who I was before I became someone else's dependent. I'd successfully run a business for 15 years, managing everything from inventory to customer relations to financial planning. I'd navigated Robert's illness with strength and grace, making difficult decisions under pressure while maintaining hope in impossible circumstances. I'd raised a son who was successful enough to afford a large house and expensive lifestyle. These weren't the accomplishments of someone who needed to be taken care of or managed by others. These were the achievements of a competent woman who'd temporarily lost her way in the aftermath of profound loss. For the first time in months, I felt something that had been missing so long I'd almost forgotten what it was called. Not hope exactly, and not anger either. Something steadier and more reliable than either emotion. I felt like myself again. And that was something they hadn't counted on. The transformation wasn't dramatic enough to attract immediate attention, but over the following weeks, small changes began to accumulate in ways that made Daniel and Sarah unconsciously uneasy. I started leaving the house more often, always with vague explanations about errands or library visits that didn't invite follow-up questions. I stopped asking permission to use the phone or computer, simply announcing that I'd be busy for a few hours without explaining what kept me occupied. Most significantly, I stopped trying to insert myself into their family activities. No more hopeful offers to help with dinner or homework. No more wistful glances toward the door when they prepared for outings without me. No more attempts to prove my worth through domestic contributions that were consistently dismissed as interference. This withdrawal seemed to confuse them more than my previous efforts to connect had annoyed them. Sarah caught me putting on my coat one Tuesday morning and asked, with what sounded like genuine curiosity, where I was going. "Just some personal business to take care of," I replied pleasantly, adjusting my scarf with the calm efficiency of someone who had places to go and things to accomplish. "Personal business?" she repeated, as if the concept of me having independent affairs to manage was somehow foreign. "Is everything okay? Do you need help with anything?" The irony wasn't lost on me. For months, they'd made it clear that they wanted me to be less present, less involved, less needful of their attention. Now that I was actually becoming more independent, they seemed unsettled by the change. It was as if they preferred me to be dependent and grateful rather than self-sufficient and occupied with matters that didn't concern them. "Everything's fine," I assured her, because it was true. For the first time in almost a year, everything actually was fine. I'm just taking care of some things I've been putting off too long. During these mysterious absences, I was systematically rebuilding the infrastructure of an independent life. The utilities at the Elm Street house were restored and functioning. I'd hired a cleaning service to address 8 months of dust and neglect, and the familiar rooms were beginning to feel like home again, rather than a museum of my former life. I'd also contacted a lawyer, not for anything dramatic or vengeful, but to ensure I understood my rights and options regarding the property I co-owned with Robert's estate. The consultation had been enlightening in ways that went beyond simple legal advice. "Mrs. Morrison," the attorney had explained after reviewing the property deed and Robert's will, "you have absolute legal right to reside in this house. In fact, your son would need your written consent to sell the property, since you own it jointly with him as your late husband's heir." Written consent. Daniel had been talking for months about dealing with Dad's house and getting it ready for market, as if these decisions were entirely his to make. But every plan he'd discussed casually in my presence required my signature to become reality. I wasn't just a surviving spouse with sentimental attachments to the family home. I was a property owner with legal standing and decision-making power. The lawyer had also explained that I could, if I chose, force a sale of the property and claim my half of the proceeds. With current market values, that would mean a check for nearly $200,000, enough to secure my independence permanently, enough to ensure I'd never again need to depend on anyone's charity or tolerance. but I wasn't interested in forcing a sale. I wanted to live in the house Robert and I had created together, surrounded by memories that brought comfort rather than pain, in space that belonged to me by right, rather than by someone else's conditional generosity. Meanwhile, my interactions with Daniel's family had settled into a polite distance that felt more honest than the strained attempts at intimacy we'd all been pretending to maintain. I was courteous but not eager, present but not intrusive, available but not desperate for their attention. This new dynamic seemed to puzzle Daniel more than it did Sarah. He'd begun making occasional attempts at conversation that felt stilted and uncertain, as if he was testing whether something had fundamentally changed between us. "You seem different lately, Mom," he said one evening when he found me reading in the living room. "More, I don't know, independent?" Independent. He said the word as if it were a medical condition that might require treatment rather than a healthy state of being for any adult. As if my previous neediness and gratitude had been more natural than my current self-sufficiency. "I suppose I am feeling more like myself again," I replied, marking my place in the book without closing it entirely. "Grief changes people, but it doesn't have to diminish them permanently." He shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say something more, but uncertain how to proceed. "Are you happy here? I mean, are we taking good care of you?" Taking good care of me. The question revealed so much about how he'd been thinking about our arrangement. I wasn't a family member sharing their home. I was a responsibility being managed, a duty being discharged with varying degrees of success. "You've been very generous," I said carefully, choosing words that were truthful without being either grateful or critical. "But I've been thinking it might be time for me to consider other arrangements." "Other arrangements?" I watched his face process this information, seeing confusion mixed with what might have been relief. For months, he and Sarah had been treating me like a problem that needed solving, but apparently they'd expected to be the ones choosing the solution. "What kind of other arrangements?" he asked, sitting down across from me with the alert attention of someone who sensed that an important conversation was about to happen. "Nothing dramatic," I assured him, because I'd learned the value of keeping my plans private until they were complete. "Just exploring some options that might give us all more space to live our lives naturally." More space to live our lives naturally. The phrase was diplomatic enough to avoid confrontation while making it clear that our current situation wasn't sustainable for any of us. I could see him trying to interpret what I meant, wondering if this was good news or something he should be concerned about. Over dinner that night, I noticed Daniel and Sarah exchanging glances more frequently than usual, having the kind of silent married communication that suggested they'd be discussing me as soon as I was out of earshot. But unlike the previous conversations I'd accidentally overheard, I wasn't anxious about what they might be planning. I had plans of my own now. The next morning, I made one final trip to the Elm Street house, this time bringing a suitcase with my most essential belongings. Not everything. That would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer yet, but enough to spend a few nights in my own home, testing how it felt to live independently again. The house welcomed me back like an old friend who'd been patiently waiting for my return. I slept in the bedroom Robert and I had shared for 30 years, but instead of being overwhelmed by memories of his illness and death, I found myself remembering the good times. The lazy Sunday mornings when we'd read newspapers in bed, the way he'd bring me coffee exactly the way I liked it, the comfortable silence of two people who'd learned to share space without constant conversation. I cooked my first real meal in months, using ingredients I'd chosen myself and preparing them the way I preferred, rather than adapting to someone else's dietary restrictions and schedule preferences. I sat at my own kitchen table, eating food I'd made in my own kitchen, planning improvements I wanted to make to my own home. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt like a person rather than a problem, like a woman with agency rather than a burden requiring management. Like someone with a future rather than someone whose useful life had ended when her husband died. When I returned to Daniel's house the next evening, carrying the small overnight bag I'd taken with me, Sarah was waiting in the kitchen with obvious curiosity. "Where have you been?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was asking more from concern about my activities than worry about my safety. "Taking care of some personal matters," I replied, using the same phrase that had become my standard response to questions about my increased independence. But this time, I added something new. I should probably mention that I'll be spending more nights away from here in the coming weeks. Just wanted you to know so you don't worry if my room is empty sometimes. The information hung in the air between us, clearly raising questions she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Where was I staying? What personal matters required overnight attention? What was I planning that I wasn't sharing with them? For the first time in our relationship, I had information they wanted, rather than being the one seeking inclusion in their decisions. The moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for arrived on a rainy Thursday evening in March, 3 weeks after I'd started my mysterious absences, and just 2 days after I'd officially moved back into the Elm Street house full-time. I'd been planning to tell Daniel and Sarah about my decision gradually, gently, in a way that would minimize drama and preserve whatever remained of our family relationships. But Daniel forced the conversation to happen on his timeline rather than mine. I was in my room at his house. I'd been staying there 2 nights a week to maintain the illusion that I still lived there while I gradually transitioned my belongings back to my own home, when I heard him on the phone in the hallway outside my door. He wasn't trying to be quiet. "Yes, I understand the market is strong right now," he was saying, his voice carrying the confident tone he used for business discussions. "I'd like to schedule an appointment to discuss listing the property. It's been empty for almost a year now, and it's time to move forward." He was talking to a real estate agent about selling the house. My house. The home Robert and I had built together. The property I owned jointly with him. The place where I'd been quietly rebuilding my independence for the past month. He was making plans to sell it without consulting me, just as he'd been making plans about my life without consulting me for nearly a year. "The property is at 247 Elm Street," he continued, and I heard him give details about square footage and lot size as if he were intimately familiar with a house he'd visited perhaps 6 times since his father's death. "I'm the heir, so there shouldn't be any complications with the title. The heir. Not one of the heirs. Not someone who owned the property jointly with his mother, but the heir singular. As if I'd somehow ceased to exist when Robert died. As if my name on the deed was just a formality that could be ignored when inconvenient. Something crystallized in that moment, listening to my son casually erase my legal rights while planning to profit from property I half owned. This wasn't about him being thoughtless or overwhelmed by responsibility. This wasn't about him trying to help me by managing complicated financial matters I couldn't handle myself. This was about him treating me like I was already dead. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway where Daniel was still talking to the realtor, discussing market analysis and comparable sales prices. When he saw me, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and finally a kind of defensive irritation, as if I were eavesdropping on private business that didn't concern me. "I'll have to call you back," he said into the phone, ending the conversation with the abrupt efficiency of someone who'd been caught doing something he knew was questionable. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice calm and level despite the anger rising in my chest. "We need to talk." "Mom, I was going to discuss this with you," he said quickly, already shifting into the apologetic but patronizing tone he used when he needed to explain adult decisions to someone he considered incapable of understanding them. "I know it's emotional, but Dad's house has been sitting empty for almost a year. It doesn't make financial sense to keep paying taxes and maintenance on a property nobody's using. Nobody's using. I'd been living in that house for 3 weeks, cooking in its kitchen, sleeping in its bedrooms, tending its garden, bringing it back to life after months of abandonment. But to Daniel, I was nobody. My presence didn't count. My claim to the property was invisible. "What makes you think nobody's using it?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he'd arrived at this conclusion. He looked confused by the question, as if the answer were obvious. "Well, it's been empty since Dad died. We've all moved on with our lives. It's time to let go of the past and be practical about these things. Moved on with our lives. All of us, apparently, except for the woman who'd actually lived in that house for 30 years and had never wanted to leave it in the first place." "Daniel," I said, feeling a strange sense of calm descend over me, "I need you to understand something very important. I haven't moved on from that house because I never left it. Not really. And I certainly haven't given you permission to sell it." "Permission?" He laughed. but it was the nervous laugh of someone who was beginning to suspect he'd misunderstood something fundamental. "Mom, I don't need permission. Dad left the house to me in his will." "Actually," I said, settling into the kind of patient tone I'd used when he was young and needed complicated concepts explained slowly, "Dad left his half of the house to you. But my half was never his to leave to anyone, because I'm still alive and I still own it." The silence that followed was loud enough to fill the entire hallway. I watched Daniel's face as he processed this information, seeing him work through the legal implications of joint ownership, spousal property rights, and the assumptions he'd been making about my financial status. "Your half," he repeated slowly, as if testing how the words sounded. "My half," I confirmed. "As in 50%. As in, you can't sell the house without my signature. As in, I have every legal right to live there, which is exactly what I've been doing for the past 3 weeks." "You've been living there?" Sarah's voice came from behind me, and I turned to see her standing at the top of the stairs, apparently drawn by the sound of our conversation. "That's where you've been going? That's your personal business?" "Among other things," I said, including her in the conversation with the same calm courtesy I was maintaining with Daniel. "I've also been meeting with lawyers to make sure I understand my rights, restoring utilities, arranging for maintenance, and generally taking care of my property." "Your property." I could see both of them absorbing this phrase, recognizing that it changed everything about our family dynamics. I wasn't their dependent anymore. I wasn't their problem to solve or their burden to manage. I was a property owner, a decision maker, someone with resources and options they hadn't known existed. "But Mom," Daniel said, and for the first time in months his voice carried genuine emotion rather than polite obligation. You seemed so lost after Dad died, so unable to cope with things. We were trying to help." "I know you were," I said, and I meant it. "And I appreciate that you opened your home to me when I was grieving and confused. But somewhere along the way, helping me became managing me, and managing me became tolerating me, and tolerating me became planning to dispose of me. That's not—" Sarah started to protest, but I held up my hand gently. "I heard you discussing nursing homes," I said simply. "I heard you talking about arrangements that would give you more space. I watched you exclude me from family activities and treat me like a burden you were generous to carry. And today, I heard Daniel planning to sell my house without consulting me, as if I were already dead and couldn't object to his decisions." The truth hung in the air between us, undenied because it was undeniable. They'd been planning my removal from their lives, systematically isolating me while positioning themselves as my caretakers rather than my family. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued, feeling stronger with every word. "I'm going to continue living in my house, which is where I belonged all along. You're going to continue living in your house, which is where you've made it clear you prefer to be without me. And we're all going to stop pretending that charity and love are the same thing." Daniel was staring at me as if I'd undergone some kind of supernatural transformation, as if the dependent mother he'd been managing had been replaced by a competent adult he didn't recognize. "But what about your financial situation?" he asked weakly. "What about your security? What about healthcare and emergencies and all the things you need help with?" "I'll manage," I said, smiling for the first time in months with genuine warmth. "I managed a business for 15 years. I managed your father's care through a terminal illness. I managed to raise a son who became successful enough to afford a house like this. I think I can manage to take care of myself." The woman who'd spent nearly a year begging for inclusion, acceptance, and love had been replaced by someone who no longer needed their permission to exist. 6 months later, I was sitting in my own garden on a warm September morning, drinking coffee from my favorite mug while watching the late-blooming roses I'd planted in memory of Robert. The house on Elm Street had been transformed from a monument to grief into a celebration of life, my life, lived on my own terms, surrounded by choices that reflected my preferences rather than someone else's tolerance. The renovations had been modest but meaningful. I'd repainted the kitchen in the sunny yellow I'd always wanted, but had compromised on when Robert preferred neutral colors. I'd converted his former office into a small library where I could read without interruption or explanation. I'd hired a landscaper to help me create a meditation garden in the backyard. a peaceful space where I could remember the past without being trapped by it. Most importantly, I'd started a new chapter that honored my history while embracing my future. The flower shop was gone, but my love for growing things had found new expression in the small business I'd launched from my home. Rita's Garden Design, specialized in creating beautiful, low-maintenance landscapes for people who wanted the joy of gardening without the overwhelming commitment it sometimes required. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was busier and more financially secure at 56 than I'd been at 55, when I'd thought my productive years were over. Clients found me through word of mouth and the simple website I'd learned to create during my library research sessions. Women my age and older who wanted their outdoor spaces to reflect their personalities rather than generic suburban expectations. I was particularly proud of the memorial garden I'd designed for Eleanor Patterson, an 80-year-old widow who'd wanted to honor her late husband's memory, with plants that would bloom throughout the seasons he'd loved. Working with her had reminded me that grief could be channeled into creation, rather than just endured as destruction. My relationship with Daniel and Sarah had settled into something more honest than what we'd pretended to maintain before. We saw each other occasionally. Holidays, birthdays, family events that required my presence as grandmother rather than my participation as dependent. The children seemed more comfortable with this arrangement too, visiting their grandmother's house like the special adventure it had become rather than encountering her as the awkward presence who complicated their home life. Daniel had been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about how he'd treated me during my year of dependency. The conversation hadn't been pleasant for either of us, but it had been necessary for both of us. "I thought I was being helpful," he'd said during one of our first honest discussions after I'd moved out. "I thought you needed someone to take care of everything for you because you seemed so lost." I was lost, I'd acknowledged, because it was true. But being lost isn't the same as being incompetent. And needing help isn't the same as needing to be managed. He'd struggled to understand the distinction at first, but gradually he'd begun to see how his good intentions had transformed into something that diminished rather than supported me. The recognition had been painful for him, I think, because Daniel wasn't cruel by nature. He'd simply fallen into the trap of believing that being needed meant being in control. Sarah had been slower to adjust to my independence, perhaps because she'd been more comfortable with the clear hierarchy that had positioned her as the competent daughter-in-law managing the declining mother-in-law. My transformation from burden to entrepreneur had disrupted her sense of family dynamics in ways that made her visibly uncomfortable during our interactions. But even Sarah had been forced to acknowledge that I was happier and healthier living independently than I'd ever been while accepting their charity. When she mentioned to her friends that Daniel's mother had started her own business and was doing quite well for herself, I could hear the surprise in her voice, as if my competence were an unexpected development rather than a recovered capacity. The grandchildren had adjusted to the new arrangement with the flexibility that children bring to changing circumstances. Tommy loved visiting my house because I let him help in the garden, teaching him to plant seeds and tend to growing things with the patience his busy parents couldn't always manage. Emma had claimed the window seat in my library as her special reading spot, and we'd established a tradition of sharing books and discussing stories without the time pressure that characterized her overscheduled life at home. These relationships felt more genuine than the interactions we'd forced when I was living under their roof. The children weren't being asked to accommodate an unwanted presence in their daily routines, and I wasn't desperately trying to prove my worth through excessive availability. We could simply enjoy each other's company during natural visits rather than navigate the complex emotions that had surrounded my previous status as permanent houseguest. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. I'd rediscovered the woman I'd been before grief and dependency had convinced me that my useful life was over. Not the same woman, loss changes people in permanent ways, but a stronger version who'd learned to distinguish between temporary vulnerability and permanent incapacity. I'd joined a widows' support group that met monthly at the community center, not because I needed help managing my grief, but because I'd learned that sharing wisdom was as important as seeking support. Many of the women in our group were struggling with the same issues I'd faced: adult children who meant well but gradually took over more decisions than necessary, financial confusion that made independence seem impossible, social isolation that made any offer of shelter seem like salvation, I'd become something of an unofficial advocate for women who found themselves in similar situations, helping them understand their legal rights, connect with resources, and distinguish between temporary assistance and permanent dependency. It was deeply satisfying work that made me feel useful in ways that went beyond personal survival. The hardest part, I'd told the group during a recent meeting, isn't losing your husband or your home or your financial security. The hardest part is losing your sense of yourself as someone capable of making decisions and solving problems. Once you get that back, everything else becomes manageable. One of the newer members, a 62-year-old woman named Catherine, whose daughter had convinced her to sell her house and move into a senior living facility she hated, had started crying when I'd finished speaking. "I used to run the accounting department for a construction company," she'd said through her tears. "I managed budgets and deadlines and dozens of employees. But somehow my own daughter thinks I'm too confused to choose what to have for breakfast." I'd given Catherine my phone number after the meeting, and she'd called me the next week to ask for help understanding her financial options. 6 weeks later, she'd moved out of the senior facility and into a small apartment that gave her independence without the maintenance responsibilities of homeownership. Her daughter hadn't been happy about the decision, but Catherine had stopped seeking permission for choices that were rightfully hers to make. These were the victories that gave my new life meaning beyond personal recovery. Every woman who reclaimed her autonomy, every family that learned to distinguish between helping and controlling, every situation where love was expressed through respect rather than management, these successes felt like small acts of justice in a world that too often discarded women the moment they seemed vulnerable. On this particular September morning, as I planned my day around a client consultation and an evening pottery class I'd started taking just because it interested me, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. A year ago, I'd been begging for inclusion in someone else's family activities. Now I was selecting which social invitations to accept based on my own schedule and preferences. A year ago, I'd been financially dependent on people who resented supporting me. Now I was earning enough from my garden design business to not only support myself comfortably, but also to start saving for the kinds of trips and experiences I'd always wanted to try. Most importantly, a year ago, I'd been convinced that my story was ending, that the interesting and productive parts of my life were finished when Robert died. Now I understood that grief had been a transition rather than a conclusion, a difficult passage between chapters rather than the final page of my book. I wasn't the same woman who'd moved into Daniel's house carrying nothing but sorrow and gratitude. I was someone who'd learned that love without respect is just another form of abandonment, that family can be rebuilt on better foundations when necessary, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to be the burden they expect you to become. As I finished my coffee and prepared to start another day of living the life I'd chosen rather than accepting the life others had planned for me, I smiled at a truth that had taken me 56 years to fully understand. Sometimes the people who try to save you need to be saved from their own good intentions. And sometimes the best way to preserve a family is to stop pretending that obligation and love are the same thing.